Good morning or afternoon, everyone. This is Keyonda Smith. If you can hear me, do you mind just raising your hand? I want to make sure that everyone can hear me. Okay, awesome. Well, I'm Keyonda Smith, and good morning or afternoon, wherever you're from in the country. And welcome to the Curriculum Innovation Webinar Series. I'm your instructional designer here at Trident University, and this is the presentation on writing effective outcomes. So first, I'll say a few words regarding the Curriculum Innovation Work Group, and then we can get started. This work group focuses on the deliberate actions to improve Trident's learning environment by adapting a variety of methods when presenting instructional materials to our students. We were developed to explore and examine the innovative instructional strategies that involve increased engagement and interactions among our learners as well as our faculty members. We are also interested in examining how to create authentic assessments in a better way and just ensure that our course content is meeting the needs of our adult learners. When curriculum innovation or changes are made to an online classroom, it has the potential to enhance the transferable skills and focus on unique methods for teaching subjects that involve historical analysis or technological or organizational lessons. So here at Trident, we are investing our time in curriculum innovation to encourage our learners as well as our faculty to make full use of the D2L learning management systems, its functionality, as well as considering adult learning theory and course delivery and its best practices. An innovative curriculum relies on learners to autonomously interact with the course materials while the instructor serves as a mentor guide instead of taking the role of the primary expert or one who controls the learning. See, this is the difference between what we call student-centered and teacher-centered instruction, because we always want to be geared more towards student-centered versus teacher-centered instructional strategies. Lastly, curriculum innovation encourages educators to defy the norm and think outside the box. By practicing this, you guys are more capable of reaching all types of learners, those who possess their own personal learning styles, instead of focusing on lessons that are just effective for only a few of your students. So in order to prepare you for what's occurring in this webinar, there are going to be several knowledge checks along the way, and at the conclusion, there will be an opportunity for questions, comments, or concerns. And this presentation should take about 45 to 50 minutes with roughly 10 to 15 minutes left at the end. And that way, if you have any questions or comments, suggestions, you can get those in at that time. I mean, you can always contact me if you think of something later on. With that said, if you're ready, we'll get started, and I will be monitoring the chat box. So if you have any questions that you just want to throw out early, I may be able to address them. If it's on your mind, you can just type it in the chat box, and I might be able to address it prior to the end if necessary. All right, so why is this topic of effective learning outcomes important? In no particular order, the first item of importance is WAS's current accreditation evaluation criteria that it requires academic units within an institution to assess its educational effectiveness by gathering and evaluating assessment data. They also suggest these data to be used in an ongoing cycle of planning and evaluation. Another reason this topic is important is because according to the 2017 Federal Student Aid Handbook, they determine 1 credit hour as equivalent to the amount of work represented in the learning outcomes. And also they require verification of this by evidence of student achievement that is institutionally established. Moreover, to meet high quality and workforce alignment goals, education leaders, practitioners, policymakers, and policy influencers such as us turn to the measurement of student learning to provide accountability and transparency. And lastly, this topic is important because creating effective learning outcomes has the greatest potential to improve student pathways and their overall achievement. For a brief definition, SLO simply describes student learning, specifically what students will know or be able to do as a result of completing a program, course, or module. Creating effective learning outcomes is strategic and can change the way you guys design your courses. And it also can identify whether your assessments are measuring what they're supposed to be measuring. First, let's look at some characteristics of effective learning outcomes. All disciplines have a body of core knowledge that students must learn to be successful, as well as a core set of applications of that knowledge in their future professional settings. Effective outcomes have three primary characteristics. Number one is a behavior. What are they to do and how are they to perform it? What is the student supposed to do? What behaviors are they exhibiting? Number two is a condition. What are the circumstances of the performances and under what conditions are they performing? And lastly, performance criteria. This is where we determine the level of acceptable performance. We typically use rubrics or something similar to measure their performance, and that is the criteria where we can say whether it's achieved. We're going to get into a whole nother webinar regarding rubrics because obviously that's a totally different subject, but that's what pretty much the performance criteria is referring to. How are we assessing their accomplishments? And lastly, they should follow the Bloom's taxonomy framework. Let's take a quick look at an example. Here's an example outcome. Students will be able to identify 2 illnesses and its associated symptoms experienced by infants in high-risk environments using somatic symptom scale. So if we dissected this outcome, we want to first identify the 3 characteristics to make sure that it is effective, which is the behavior, the condition, and the performance criteria. First, here's the behavior, which is typically a verb. What the student is expected to do after learning. Therefore, in our example, the behavior is students will be able to identify 2 illnesses and its associated symptoms. Next is the condition. This is the circumstances under which the student will be able to perform. And in our example, the condition is experienced by infants in high-risk environments. And lastly, the performance criteria. This is the level or rules of acceptable performance. For that reason, in our example, the performance criteria is using the somatic symptom scale. Now, yes, I do understand that this will take practice and time to get the hang of for some of us, but remember there are numerous resources available to assist you when the time comes to create your SLOs. And the terminology that I'm using is preferential. There are times when you're doing research into creating and developing your learning outcomes that the terminology may be slightly different, but the premise and the concept and the foundations are still the same. Let's move on to examine Bloom's 6 levels of learning. Hopefully you're slightly familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. Not saying you have to be an expert, but if you're familiar with Bloom's, he has introduced 6 levels of learning. So Bloom's taxonomy of educational outcomes, it was published in 1956 and it was revised in 2001, and it provides us with 6 levels of learning. And these levels of learning were created to express outcomes in a way that reflects learner skills and their abilities. According to the literature, each of these 6 levels are accompanied by a variety of verbs that were found appropriate to measure its achievement. Let's delve a little deeper into these 6 levels, from the lowest level of learner cognition to the highest. The lowest or introductory level of cognition is that of knowing and comprehending. Students who are newly introduced to course content will start at this introductory level. Here they are tasked through assessments with verbs such as describe, define, or summarize to show their achievement of knowledge or comprehension. The next 2 levels are applying and analyzing. Now, as learners advance to the 3rd and 4th level here, their outcomes and assessments will contain verbs similar to develop, utilize, diagram, or outline. These are only a few of the verbs you may see. This is by no means a comprehensive list of the verbs. And lastly, the most advanced learners will fall into the 5th and 6th level of cognition, which is synthesizing and evaluating. Here, the outcomes and assignments will measure their ability to perform functions such as adapting, combining, generating, critiquing, or even analyzing. And they can also use that term when they start getting into the more advanced levels of knowledge. We have now approached the opportunity to complete our first knowledge check. On your screen, there's going to be options that will appear for you to make your selection. Your answers are anonymous, so it's okay if it's incorrect. It's not a big, huge deal. The question is, according to Bloom, 1973, which of the 6 levels of learning describes the most appropriate form of assessment for advanced learners? Let's take about 10 seconds to give you an opportunity to answer that. Wow, okay. Looks like everyone pretty much got it right. It is C. If you answered C, you are correct. These assessments may task learners with verbs such as adapt, combine, compare, contrast, design, generate, critique, or justify. That is your synthesizing and evaluating level of cognition according to Bloom. Let's take a closer look at a few more of these verbs for effective learning outcomes. These are only a few outlined by Bloom in 1956 to describe measurable student learning. And student learning outcomes are statements of what students will potentially learn in a course. These statements are focused on the student by answering questions such as what will students learn today, rather than focused on the instructor by asking something like, what am I going to teach today? Now, outcome statements should include a verb and an impact phrase, such as what students will be able to do, under what conditions, and how to determine an appropriate level of them doing that task. Or in other words, going back to our 3 characteristics that we spoke about a few slides ago, and that was the behavior, the condition, and the performance criteria. I would like to take a quick moment to reiterate and kind of refresh Bloom's 6 levels of learning that I talked about a few slides ago. For knowledge and comprehending, if learners are on Bloom's introductory level of knowledge, you may see verbs such as define, list, or recognize. That's appropriate. These verbs here are not all you'll see, but they are to give you an idea of verbs similar when students are just being introduced to the content. If they are new students and the content is new, we don't want to have them doing things that's asking them to correlate, diagram, distinguish, outline, infer. We wouldn't ask that to a student in their first term or first part of the semester, because that is on the higher level of learning, and we haven't quite gotten to that stage just yet. So in comprehension and understanding specifically, they're a little higher on Bloom's introductory level. Although they are still introductory, they're just a little bit higher. You'll see verbs like characterize, describe, explain, identify, locate, recognize, and sort. It's tons of other verbs you can use, but you need to stay on this level if you're talking about newly introduced content to students who have not had exposure just yet. Moving forward to the next level of advancement, learners should now be able to show application. So when we get into applying, you'll see verbs such as choose, demonstrate, implement, or perform. They should be doing something. If you're going to have a learning outcome that says students will be able to develop something, they should not be given a multiple choice questionnaire, right? Because they're not actually developing. So applying is when you're moving into your mid-level of learning. Now, as learners continue with their studies, they will reach the mid to high cognitive level of analysis. Analysis, you will see verbs such as categorize, compare, differentiate. These are appropriate for learners on this level for their assessments as well as their outcome. More advanced learners should be able to synthesize the course materials or integrate. So you may use verbs like construct, design, formulate, or organize when they start getting into this level of learning. And lastly, the most advanced learners are on your evaluating level. And these are usually your learners who are towards the end of their studies. They are typically tasked with words such as assess, critique, rank, or even rate. In addition to Bloom's action verbs, he also identified 3 domains of educational activities to promote learning: cognitive, psychomotor, and affective. Cognitive are your mental skills, such as just your knowledge. What do the students know? Your psychomotor, what can they do? Manual or physical skills. And then your affective, which is your attitude. What do you value? The growth and feelings, their emotional areas. What is their attitude or their sense of self? In no specific order, the cognitive domain involves knowledge and the development of intellectual skills. Now, this includes the recall or recognition of specific facts, maybe a procedure, and concepts that serve in the development of intellectual abilities. The verbs you choose out of the cognitive domain are determined by their appropriate level of learning. And this is back to our 6 levels of learning that we discussed about 2 slides ago. For example, if learners who are enrolled in an associate's degree program, they're taking, say, English 101, the outcome or assessment verbs may consist of terms like summarize, apply, or write, as these are on the lower level of cognition, and they're appropriate for introductory course material. So you'll see some of the introductory action verbs that are used for the lower level, as far as some advanced level of cognition here. But introductory out of this list, it will be some of the lower level verbs such as this one right here for write, that's introductory. But then if I tell them to generate something, and that's applying, so that's a mid-level of knowledge. If they're introductory students and they are in first or second week of the course, I may not ask them to generate just yet because that is on a more advanced level of learning. All right, next is the psychomotor domain. It is specific to, say, your discrete functional physical functions like your reflex actions or interpretive movements. Traditionally, these types of outcomes are concerned with the physically encoding of information with movement or with activities where the gross or fine motor skills are used to express or interpret the course's information or concepts. For example, learners in an advanced course of their master's degree program, they may be assessed with verbs similar to diagram, conduct, or build, as those are appropriate for the mid-level skills based on your instruction. And you can see some other verbs here that's outlined in your slide. For psychomotor, they may be asked to respond, assemble, build, depending on what level of learning they're on. So if they're more advanced, for advanced learners, they're asked to design, or mid-level may be asked to build something, and entry-level may be asked to compose something that they're memorizing or to do a procedure that they're copying or to mimic. Lastly is the affective or your attitudes. Krathwohl, Bloom, and Messiah in 1973, they identified the affective domain as the manner in which we handle things emotionally, such as our feelings, our values, our appreciations, our enthusiasms, our motivations, and just how we feel about ourselves and the world that we live in. For faculty member in a doctorate level course, they might create learning outcomes and assess these outcomes with verbs that are similar to justify, propose, or advocate. As these are advanced levels of skills, they're deemed appropriate for doctoral level students. But entry students may be asked to do something lower level like share. That's on a lower level, but then again, advocate is on a much higher level of synthesizing. And also interpret, that's a higher level of knowledge or higher level of cognition. So we wouldn't ask an entry-level student, that would not be in their outcomes, and that they would not be assigned to interpret something in their first half of their learning. And formulate is kind of mid to high level of knowledge. So as they get into nearing their advanced stage, you may ask them to formulate something, and that is going to show how their attitudes are pertaining to the course materials. All right, so in order for an outcome to provide maximum organization to your instruction, it should be free of those vague and ambiguous words, such as those seen here in this shortened list. Now, this list of immeasurable verbs such as understand, appreciate, become familiar with, learn, or become aware. These verbs are not measurable. They're also not observable by any instructor. So keep in mind that these are only a few verbs that are notoriously ambiguous, and they should be avoided so that the intended outcome is concise and explicit. That leads us to further explore how to handle these complicated verbs. If you're not sure as to whether your statement is an actual outcome, ask yourself these 2 questions. What would students be able to do if they understood, appreciated, were familiar with, thought about, or became aware of? What would they be able to do to show these skills? Or ask another question to yourself, like, is this what I want the students to be able to do at the end of the course, the module, or the program? Novel course developers tend to write descriptions of what is to occur during the instruction, or in other words, course activities, as if they were learning outcomes. An example I just recently seen is an outcome that stated students will be able to view a film on medical office etiquette, and students will read pages 45 through 60 in your textbook. These are instructional activities. They do not measure whether learners have achieved the outcomes. So learning outcomes should reflect what the participant should know or be able to do at the end of the learning period. Instructional outcomes, they reflect what the instructor intends to accomplish. Therefore, state how we are to determine that the learner has gained knowledge rather than what we are teaching. Another way to look at this is to consider a learning outcome as student-oriented, but a teaching or instructional outcome as just describing a process. Or the outcome should describe a participant outcome rather than what will be taught or covered during the course. All right, so let's do 2 more knowledge checks, and just keep in mind that your answers are anonymous. So which learning outcome is better of these 2? And we'll take about 10 seconds. Of these 2, which is better? The student will be able to understand regression models and time series models in economics, or the student will be able to interpret and develop regression models and time series models in economics. All right, so the best answer is B. The students will be able to interpret and develop regression models and time series models. I see some people had an issue with selecting them. That's okay. Hopefully it'll work on the next time around. But it's okay. The answer is B. The reason A is not the best choice is because the verb understand is an internal process. It's not easily observable by the instructor. And even though I'm personally not a fan of 2 verbs being used in one outcome, I'm learning to adjust to this concept because let's say if the faculty member will task the learners with both verbs to measure the outcome, I'll say, okay, it's appropriate. However, if the faculty member has 2 different assessments in separate sections of the course, I'd advise against using multiple verbs just because it's too difficult to track throughout the course. All right, and I don't know, hopefully you'll be able to use the poll again. I'll select it again. Hopefully you can use it. If not, just let me know in the chat box if it doesn't show up for you. All right, I see it showed up for you. Good, thanks. So which is better? Students will know the differences in major contemporary theories in the field of sociology, or students will be able to contrast major contemporary theories in the field of sociology. Which is better? Which learning outcome? Okay, great. Well, good job. Once again, the best answer is B. Students will be able to contrast major contemporary theories in the field of sociology. The same rule applies here. The verb to know, such as in option A, is internal. Learners can demonstrate knowledge by being tasked to define, describe, list, reproduce, enumerate, etc. Therefore, those are the verbs that should be used to explicitly state their learning outcomes. Now, I would like to briefly introduce you to the 3-level model of developing measurable learning outcomes. Before I do that, I did get a question. Peggy asked, for quizzes, would you give some examples of verbs to use? Would demonstrate knowledge work? Now think about that. If I'm giving you a quiz, it depends. Is the quiz multiple choice or is it open-ended? If it's a multiple choice quiz, you can't demonstrate knowledge by selecting multiple choice, because think about what the word demonstrate means. That means you're doing something. It's an action verb. So it's hard for me to see action in you just selecting A, B, C, or D. So if it's going to be a multiple choice, you might want to use a word like identify, define, select, or choose. Right, Peggy? If it's a open-ended quiz where the learners have to write a paragraph or summarize, you can definitely say demonstrate knowledge because they're explaining something to you, they're discussing, they're summarizing something to you. So therefore, they're able to more effectively demonstrate knowledge. I hope I was able to answer your question. And feel free to type in any additional questions you guys may have. And if I'm able to catch them, I'll stop and answer them for you, okay? All right, so moving on to the 3-level model of developing measurable learning outcomes. First, there is the university level. And these are actually goals. Therefore, they are broad and overarching. Goals are not always as specific, and sometimes they're not even measurable, and that's okay. And that's on a much higher, say, the university level. These are not going to be objectives. They can be, that's fine, but you'll usually see them as goals. Now, when we move on to the program level, the student learning goals produce the outcomes, and these outcomes describe what students will do to determine or to demonstrate that they have met the learning goals. Now, these are a little bit more specific and more measurable. And as we move to the course level of student learning outcomes, they are determined by the faculty, and they specify course level outcomes that are observable or measurable or demonstrable. And these are very specific and very measurable. And this model allows you to develop assessments that measure the outcomes and then connect them directly to the program and the course level learning goals. So let's take a look really quick at the assessment cycle. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the assessment cycle, just look at it briefly. The method of assessing learners' achievement is going to start with you creating or modifying some measurable and appropriate outcomes. And finally, you will evaluate the learners on their successfully accomplishing the outcome. So if you're going to assess your learners' achievement of outcomes, this can occur in a variety of ways. And if you have outcomes that are stated, in order for you to know if they've achieved the outcomes, you must assess them. Now, I'm not saying that all outcomes must be graded, but what I'm saying is all outcomes must be assessed. And assessments can be, essays, your quizzes, or some type of action. But it doesn't necessarily have to be graded. But if you have an outcome in your course, I need to see where the learners have achieved this outcome. That way we can measure learning. The most direct method of assessing, it typically includes the use of rubrics that as I mentioned earlier. And you can assess your essays, your exam questions, have them create an exhibit, something, or demonstrate, or their e-portfolio, things of that nature. Now, rubrics are used to assess how well students perform a task. Now, I've been asked by faculty, well, when should I use a rubric and when should I not use a rubric? The short answer on that, if it's not multiple choice, then rubrics should be used for any graded assignment. Any assignment where they're going to receive a grade, you should use a rubric if it's not something that's multiple choice. However, the long answer of that, if the assignment requires an answer that's more complicated than one that can be corrected with an answer key, then use a rubric. If you can use an answer key, you probably don't need a rubric. Another stipulation to that is when complex products or behaviors are being evaluated that require more than a right or, say, a wrong answer, then you use a rubric. When determining how well students are performing a task, such as speaking, writing, doing a performance, etc., use a rubric. Anytime the answer is anything except right or wrong, use a rubric. And lastly, if there is a quality continuum that ranges from, say, exceptional to not meeting expectations, then use a rubric. Certainly ensuring that rubrics are accurately measuring what it's supposed to measure should be explained in an entirely separate webinar. So I won't spend a lot of time on it, but nonetheless, this is one of the more tangible methods to provide evidence of achievement. So lastly, we're going to do a final set of 5 knowledge checks. What is the closest definition of student learning outcomes? All right, nice. Definitely the correct answer is A. Student learning outcomes are what students will know and be able to do as a result of completing a program, course, module, unit, whatever it is you're completing. B is not correct, as this is the definition of a rubric, and C is incorrect because these are actually personal student goals. They're not learning outcomes. What are the 3 characteristics of an effective student learning outcome? Which of these are the 3 characteristics? Okay, so we're kind of split between 1 and a lot of people think it's A, a lot of people think it's C, a few think it's B. Let's see here. So the correct answer is actually C. Behavior, condition, performance criteria. Behavior is the verb. This is what they are to do, how they are perform it. The condition is the circumstances of the performance, or what conditions are they performing it. And the performance criteria. This is how you determine the level of students' acceptable performance. These are the characteristics of an effective SLO. They must have a behavior, a condition, and a performance criteria to start off. Now, I'm not going to use a poll for this, but if there's any brave soul who would like to type in the chat box, then you can type in for me. Of the below SLO verbs, which are measurable, if anyone wants to voluntarily type in the chat box what they feel are the realistically measurable of this list, feel free to do that. And I'll give you a hint. There's only four of these. Okay, I do see one answer. Peggy. Pam gave me an answer. Okay. Does anyone agree or disagree with Pam? Okay, wow, I guess there is a consensus that everyone agrees. The correct answers are A, B, D, and E. C, F, and G are not measurable verbs, and they should be avoided when developing your outcomes because obviously those are processes and they're not realistically observable. Now I want to go back to Peggy's question where she said if I could discuss the difference between outcome and objectives. She feels like she's assuming outcomes are student-oriented, and so our objectives teaching-oriented. There's a lot of debate about the difference between your outcomes and objectives. In my opinion, which we're going to have to do a little bit more research on this because it is open for debate. So I will dig up a little bit more information on the difference between those because there are a lot of arguments about how they're being used. And we would like to use the most current information and research to make sure that we have the most updated knowledge. So I'll be sure that I get you guys some information about the difference between those two. And we can go into more detail about that. Probably should do a webinar on that just alone, right? All right, those are your answers from the last knowledge check, A, B, D, and E. So that is correct. Thank you. I think Pam was the first one to answer that one correctly. So thank you so much. And you had a lot of people that agreed with you. So good job. The next one, of these choices, and I'll use your poll for this. Of these choices, which are Bloom's 3 domains of learning? 1, 2, or 3, or A, B, or C? Bloom's 3 domains of learning. Okay, so we have mostly everyone said A. We had a few folks on B because get the terminology a little mixed up there, and it is A. The answer is A. These are the domains of learning. That's cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Cognitive is your knowledge or your mental skills. Your affective is your emotional areas, like your attitude or your sense of self. And then your psychomotor, which is your manual or your physical skills. Now, B was incorrect because we know those are the levels of learning, and C are just the characteristics of the effective SLOs. And last but not least, according to the 3-level model of developing measurable SLOs, select the letter that accurately reflects the level on the left matched with this corresponding function on the right. Let me get your poll option there. Do you think it's A, B, C, or, well, A, B, or C? Which level? Is it 213? Is it 312 or 132? I'll give you a little extra time on this one. Okay. We're getting some answers, and I'll give you a little bit more time on it. You think about your university level, your program level, and then your course level. Which one is broad? Which one is more specific? And which one is very specific? All right, nice. Mostly everyone, a few folks think it's the other way around, but in actuality, it is A. This is the 3-level model of developing measurable learning outcomes. First, your university level. These are actually goals. They are broad and overarching. And next, you have your program levels. These are more specific. They show what students will do to demonstrate that they have met the learning goals. And lastly, you have your course level outcomes. They're determined by faculty. They specify course, unit, section, levels of observable products or demonstrations. To sum up the key points, this is going to conclude our presentation on writing effective learning outcomes. Here's a quick summary. We briefly introduced you all to the definition of SLOs, some characteristics, Bloom's 6 levels of learning, some verbs for effective SLOs, the 3 domains of learning, and verbs that complicate SLO effectiveness, and a brief introduction to the assessment cycle. And also I'm going to get you some information regarding an outcome versus an objective. All right, I have a question. Should we have one outcome for each assignment, or can there be more than one outcome for an assignment? In my opinion, it depends on how the assignment is structured, and it depends on what verbs you're using. So if you're saying the students will be able to explain and select, then that can be that can be a lot for one assessment, because that's going to be open-ended. You're going to expect the student to give you an explanation, and then it sounds like they're going to be choosing multiple choice as well. So then they're going to have to select something. And so that's an open and a closed-ended in one question. I would separate those just to make sure that we're accurately measuring. I'm not a huge fan of multiple verbs being used in one outcome. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just not a huge fan of it, because it's hard for me to track that in the course to make sure that the students are achieving that, because a lot of times they're not side by side, or it won't be in the same quiz or the same assessment. It's throughout multiple assessments. So if we keep it more aligned and linear, it's easier for us to make sure that students have achieved the learning outcomes. Okay, I hope that answered your question. And if you have a question, you feel free to raise your hand and I'll unmute you. If not, we can conclude here, or you can always email me your questions at a later time. All right, so I don't see any hands raised. Well, you're welcome, Brandon. Thank you for coming. If you guys have any questions later on, my email is keyonda.smith@trident.edu, and I will let you all have your 12 minutes back. Well, thank you all for coming, and I'll talk to you soon.